That night, when I received the digital invitation to my ex-husband's CEO inauguration gala, my hands shook so much, I almost dropped my phone. The bold, glittering letters on the screen felt like a cold, calculated slap. Cordially invites you. Guest of honor. I had just signed the final divorce papers less than a week ago, effectively erased from the very company I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into building. Yet, he still had the nerve to calmly invite me to watch his coronation. I was still trying to fathom where his audacity came from, when my father, a man who had been a man of few words, his entire life, glanced at the screen, gave a subtle, knowing smirk, and said slowly, "Just go. There's a good show waiting for you." In that exact moment, I realized this gala wasn't going to be a celebration. It was the opening act of a play where the man who thought he had won everything was about to lose it all. The morning of the divorce, the sky over Chicago was a heavy lead gray. It wasn't raining, but the air was suffocating. The mediator's office was tucked away in an older brick building downtown, the sidewalk outside chipped and stained by time. I sat in a familiar leather chair, my hands resting on my lap, palms ice-cold despite the occasional wave of nervous sweat. In front of me lay the final divorce decree, a thin stack of paper, yet so heavy that signing it felt like tearing a decade of my life in half. Richard, my husband, or rather, soon-to-be ex-husband, sat across from me. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a crisp white shirt, his wrist flashing a Rolex I had bought him during our first successful business trip. His face was unnervingly calm. His eyes didn't avoid mine, nor did he bother feigning any remorse. To him, this morning felt more like a routine corporate board meeting than the death of a 10-year marriage. "Did you read it carefully?" he asked. His voice was flat, neither high nor low, as if he was afraid someone might mistakenly believe we had once loved each other deeply. I nodded. In truth, I had memorized it. The asset division clauses were chillingly clean. I was walking away with nothing, no equity, no voting rights, no liabilities, and no benefits. A shattered marriage, handled as efficiently as the termination of an employment contract. The lawyer pushed the document toward me. The heavy black pen rolled slightly on the mahogany desk, making a dry clack. It was a small sound, but in my head, it echoed like a heavy iron gate slamming shut. I picked up the pen. As the tip touched the paper, my hand trembled. Not out of fear, but because I suddenly remembered the early days when we built the startup together. Our cramped studio apartment, the desk made of a wooden plank, resting on 2 cardboard boxes. I typed up the business plans, he made the cold calls. When we landed our first contract, I cried tears of joy, and he held me in that sweltering room, promising that whatever we built would always belong to us. Yet today, it all amounted to the word, nothing. I signed my name in a long, unbroken stroke. No hesitation. Even I was surprised by my own composure. When the lawyer stamped the final seal, the dry, hollow thud sounded like a hammer driving a nail into the coffin of an entire era of my life. Richard stood up first, adjusted his collar, and said briefly, "Well, that's done. You can pack up your things whenever you're ready." Not a single word of apology, not a hint of regret. I stood up after him and walked out into the long, narrow corridor where pale, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the tiled floor. At the end of the hall, I saw my ex-mother-in-law, Eleanor. She stood there clutching a Birkin bag, her judgmental eyes sweeping over me from head to toe, lingering on my worn-out handbag, an old item barely worth a dime. She didn't speak directly to me, but turned to the woman accompanying her, intentionally lowering her voice just enough so I could hear. Better to divorce early and cut the dead weight. A woman who can't even give him children and always meddles in his business affairs. What's the point of keeping her around? I didn't stop, nor did I turn back. I knew that if I looked at her, I might actually laugh. A bitter laugh. The laugh of someone realizing a late, harsh truth. In that family, I was never considered kin. I was just a temporary tool. Stepping out onto the street, the morning sun hadn't yet pierced the skyline, but the glare was blinding. People rushed by, traffic hummed, the world was operating normally. Only my universe had quietly collapsed, and no one even noticed. I stood frozen for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and hailed a cab back to the townhouse we once called our shared home. My key still opened the door. The familiar scent of the house remained, but the sense of belonging was gone. On the shoe rack, Richard's Oxfords sat neatly, as if their owner hadn't just committed the ultimate betrayal. I dragged my suitcase into the living room and began packing. Every drawer I opened was a fragment of memory. The dress I wore to our company's first anniversary gala, the files I had stayed up all night editing, the notebooks filled with growth strategies that I truly believed were our future. Then, I froze. The bottom drawer in the home office where I kept our most vital financial and corporate documents was completely empty. I tore through the room, opening every cabinet and desk drawer. My heart pounded so hard my ears rang. The desktop computer was still there, but when I booted it up, all accounts had been logged out, and the recovery emails had been changed. I slumped into the chair, staring at the blank screen, a freezing chill running down my spine. That was the moment I understood. The divorce was only step one. What awaited me wasn't freedom. It was a rigged chess game, where I had been swept off the board before I even realized I was playing. And that was the exact moment I realized my story didn't end with a divorce decree. It had only just begun. I sat in my parents' living room, in the suburbs for nearly an hour, without saying a word. On the coffee table, my mug of tea had gone cold. Outside, the sun hadn't yet pierced through the oak trees, but the brightness was glaring. Inside my chest, however, it was pitch black, as if someone had drawn heavy curtains over my soul. My dad, Arthur, didn't push. He didn't bombard me with questions. He understood that after certain falls, a person needs a few minutes of silence to gather their own shattered pieces. I broke the silence first. Dad, if they took all the files, changed the accounts, and revoked my access, it means I have nothing left, right? My dad took a sip of his coffee and set the mug down gently, though the clink against the coaster sounded crystal clear. No, he said. You lost your access. That doesn't mean you lost the company. I looked up at him, my heart racing. But legally, they wiped everything clean. He looked me dead in the eye, his voice slow but absolute. Paperwork is only valuable when it's legal. If paperwork is created through fraud, it's just a script waiting for the curtain to be pulled. He stood up, went to his study, and pulled an old laptop from a locked drawer. Its edges were worn, the keyboard faded, but when he turned it on, it ran surprisingly smooth. Look at this, he said. I pulled my chair closer. He logged into an encrypted folder with a massive passcode. When the screen loaded, I was stunned. Inside were hundreds of scanned files, the initial operating agreements, cap tables, minutes from the first board meetings, and email threads discussing strategy between me and our early angel investors. Most importantly, there was a shareholder agreement bearing my name, signed long before the latest corporate restructuring was filed. My hands shook. Dad, how do you have all this? He gave a dry smile. I stopped trusting that boy the day he started hiding financial details from you. I quietly kept backups, not to ruin anyone, but as an insurance policy in case they tried to ruin you. I bowed my head. For the first time since the divorce, a real lump formed in my throat. Before Dad could say anything else, my phone buzzed. A text message from Richard's trusted executive assistant. Sarah, please don't misunderstand. The equity restructuring was a unanimous board decision. Richard is in a tough spot too. We hope you understand and keep things quiet, so we can all move on peacefully. I let out a dry, hollow laugh. Peacefully. Such a gentle word. Peaceful for whom? For the person kicked to the curb, or for the thief who, having just robbed you blind, wants you to stay silent? My dad looked at the text and shook his head. It's starting. When they advise you to stay quiet, it means they are terrified of you speaking up. I took a deep breath. For the first time that day, the fear inside me began to recede, replaced by something else entirely. Absolute clarity. That afternoon, I tried logging into the company's internal intranet using legacy credentials. Everything threw an error. The company's public website had updated its About Us page. A sleek photo of Richard stood center stage. Below it read, CEO and founder. My name was gone. My title as co-founder was gone. Any trace that I had ever existed had been scrubbed clean. I scrolled down to the public shareholder list. My name wasn't there. I turned off the screen. At that moment, I realized a painful but raw truth. They didn't just want to steal the company. They wanted to erase me from its history. That evening, I received another call. This time from a former vendor, someone I had worked closely with during our startup phase. He hesitated before speaking. I just called to check in. I heard you're no longer with Vanguard Tech. I stayed silent for a moment. Who told you that? He sighed. Richard. He said you voluntarily stepped down, took a massive buyout, and walked away. I gripped the phone tightly. What filled my head wasn't a fiery rage, but a frigid, calculated coldness. It was the realization that not only were my files stolen, but my reputation was being systematically assassinated. I hung up and sat motionless on the couch. My mother walked in, placing a trembling hand on my shoulder. Sweetheart, maybe we should just move away. Consider it bad luck and start over. Before I could answer, my dad spoke up, his voice cutting through the room. No. He looked at me, his eyes deep and stern. If you walk away now, the lie they tell about you will become the only truth. He turned to me, articulating every word. You don't need to attack them right away. You just need to show up at the exact right moment. My heart hammered against my ribs. When is the right moment? Dad picked up my phone and opened the email inviting me to Richard's CEO gala. The screen's glow highlighted the wrinkles on his face, but his eyes were chillingly sharp. The right moment, he said, is when they think you've surrendered. When they are standing on stage in front of the entire board, the press, and the investors. When they believe you have nowhere left to run. He handed the phone back to me. That night, you will not attend as his ex-wife. You will attend as the woman who had $40 million stolen from her. I gripped the phone. For the first time since signing the divorce papers, I no longer felt like a loser. Outside, the sky darkened, and the streetlights flickered on. I looked out the window to the driveway, where I had once been a woman who believed in marriage and the power of partnership. Now, I understood. In some games of chess, the opponent deliberately lets you think you've lost, only to set the stage for the biggest mistake of their lives. And that gala was going to be the place where everything stolen from me would be reclaimed. The invitation email sat there, glowing on my phone screen, like a deliberate taunt. A sleek, black background with gold trim, the company logo perfectly centered a logo I had designed myself, choosing every line, color, and font spacing. Beneath it was the formal text, Inauguration Gala for the CEO of Vanguard Tech. Richard's name was printed in bold. Mine was smaller, politely tucked into the guest of honor section. A meticulously calculated arrangement, close enough to feign residual goodwill, yet far enough to establish that I no longer belonged to that world. I locked my screen and leaned back. The fiery rage in my head had vanished, replaced by the suffocating sensation of being locked inside a beautiful, velvet-lined box. Every trap is the same. Before it snaps shut, it always lures you in with politeness. Later that afternoon, I received a few more calls. Some were genuine check-ins. Others were thinly veiled fishing expeditions. The common theme was always, "Are you okay?" A question that sounded like concern, but masked an intense curiosity about just how badly I had lost. I answered briefly and offered no explanations. My silence left the callers far more unnerved than I expected. That night, Richard called. His name lit up my screen. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. "Did you get the invite?" His voice was smooth, just familiar enough, just distant enough. "I did. I want you there, Sarah. Not just for appearances, but out of respect for our history." He spoke as if granting me a royal pardon. I smiled a smile he couldn't see. "Don't worry, Richard. I'll be there." There was a half-second pause on the line before his voice dropped to a softer register. "I know the equity situation has been hard for you to swallow, but everything was done by the book. If you show up, people will see that we handled this civilized." Civilized. I mouthed the word. By his definition, civilized meant that after robbing someone blind, you expect the victim to stand up and applaud you. "Yeah," I said, "civilized." I hung up. In the living room, my dad was still sitting in his armchair, the warm lamplight casting a steady glow on his face. He didn't ask what Richard said. He only asked one quiet question. "Are you scared?" I thought for a second. Yes. But I'm not shaking anymore. He nodded. Good. Being scared but not shaking. That's when you're finally awake. The days leading up to the gala passed with bizarre tranquility. I didn't scramble to prepare like a soldier marching to war, nor did I hide. I lived at my normal pace, eating well, sleeping a full 8 hours, going for my morning runs. My dad, meanwhile, quietly made a few brief phone calls, keeping his voice low. I didn't ask who he was calling. I had learned to trust this time, trusting the right person. The night before the event, I opened my closet and picked out a simple, neutral-toned dress. Nothing sparkly, nothing flashy. I wasn't going to grab attention. I was going to stand my ground. I hung the dress on the closet door, staring at it like a silent vow. Tomorrow, I will not break. The morning of the gala, the city woke up to brilliant sunshine. The luxury hotel hosting the event sat on a wide downtown avenue, lined with manicured trees. Valets rushed back and forth, and a massive digital banner above the entrance glowed with congratulations. I stepped out of my Uber. The evening breeze carried the scent of expensive floral arrangements and high-end cologne. The grand ballroom was dazzling crystal chandeliers, plush carpets, the clinking of champagne flutes blending with polite laughter. People glanced at me just long enough to recognize me, then quickly looked away. I saw pity. I saw morbid curiosity. I even saw veiled gloating hidden behind networking smiles. And then I saw Richard. He stood in the center of the foyer, wearing a bespoke black tuxedo and a deep navy bow tie, the exact shade I had picked out for his first major pitch years ago. He was shaking hands with VIPs, flashing a wide, confident grin. When he spotted me, he quickened his pace, a glimmer of poorly concealed satisfaction in his eyes. "You made it," he said, extending his hand. I shook it. His hand was warm. Mine was ice cold. "Congratulations," I said. He smiled the smile of a man who believed the world was safely tucked in his pocket. "Thank you, Sarah. Please, make yourself comfortable tonight. Treat this like you're still family." "Family." I nodded and pulled my hand back. The orchestral music swelled. The MC took the stage. I found a seat at a table that wasn't too close to the stage, but not too far either. My dad arrived shortly after and sat next to me. He scanned the ballroom, his eyes as calm as a man watching a movie he had already read the script for. "Full house," I whispered. "Yeah," he replied softly. "A full house makes the truth echo louder." The stage lights brightened. Richard stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone. His voice echoed with practiced charisma. He talked about his startup journey, his vision, the future. His name was repeated over and over, every round of applause acting as an exclamation point on his victory. I listened without letting my emotions spike, until he uttered the phrase, "I am the one who laid the very first brick of Vanguard Tech's foundation." My chest tightened, but it didn't hurt. It felt like waiting for your name to be called at a graduation, just in a very different context. My dad leaned in and whispered, "Here comes the good part." I took a deep breath. Amidst the roaring applause, I knew the trapdoor had opened, and when people are too busy admiring a velvet box, they usually forget to check if the floor beneath them is solid. Behind the flashing lights and his arrogant smile, a massive freefall was rapidly approaching. The ambient music faded, making way for prolonged applause as Richard bowed his head gracefully at the end of his speech. Sweeping spotlights panned across the room, illuminating glowing faces, expensive tuxedos, and designer gowns. Everyone wore the same expression, the belief that they were witnessing a man ascending to the pinnacle of corporate success. Only my dad and I weren't clapping. My dad sat perfectly upright, his hands resting on his knees, his demeanor so placid it felt utterly alien in that sea of jubilation. He watched the stage like an audience member at a magic show who already knows where the rabbit is hidden. I leaned over and whispered, "Dad, now I'm actually a little scared." He didn't look at me, just offered a faint, almost imperceptible smirk that made me shiver. "You should be," he murmured. "But remember, the scariest person in this room tonight isn't you." I swallowed hard. On stage, the MC invited Richard to remain at the podium for the formal presentation of his CEO mandate. The massive LED screen behind them began playing a corporate montage. Familiar images flashed by. The early days in our cramped office, signing our first vendor contracts, the celebratory dinners. I saw glimpses of myself. Never full face, never center frame, but I recognized my hair, my posture, my profile. I saw the moments I stood in the background, handing over term sheets or whispering rapid-fire strategies. The video was masterfully edited just enough to ensure no one would say my name, but just enough to avoid raising questions about my total absence. Another round of applause erupted. Richard looked down at the front row and caught my eye. He smiled and raised his champagne glass in a polite, aristocratic toast. That smile confirmed it. He truly believed I was sitting there solely to bear witness to his total victory. My dad leaned closer to my ear. See that? When a man wins big, he rewrites history to favor himself. Tell the lie long enough, and they start believing it's the only truth. And what about me? I whispered back. Dad replied instantly, without hesitation. You are the one holding the last remaining piece of the truth. On stage, the MC invited the chairman of the board to present the mandate. A silver-haired man stepped forward, holding a red leather-bound folder. He read slowly, his voice booming with authority, every word stamping Richard's new reality into existence. When he formally announced the title of Chief Executive Officer, the entire ballroom gave a standing ovation. Reflexively, I stood up, but my dad remained seated. His refusal to stand in a room of 500 standing people drew a few stares. I tugged his sleeve and whispered, Dad. He shook his head slightly. You stand. I'm fine right here. I suddenly understood. He wasn't sitting out of disrespect. He was sitting to wait. The applause died down, and the MC beamed. And now, a few words from our new CEO as he officially takes the helm. Richard approached the microphone again. This time, he held it longer. He spoke of fiduciary duty, corporate governance, and elevating Vanguard Tech to $1 billion valuation. Every sentence was mathematically calculated, just humble enough, just arrogant enough. The crowd nodded along. Several major shareholders smiled in deep satisfaction. He wrapped up with a beautiful closer. And I want to extend my deepest gratitude to those who walked alongside me during this incredible journey. I waited knowing it was futile for my name. But he stopped right there, bowing to another wave of applause. That was when my dad finally stood up. He didn't rush. He stood up like a man taking a casual evening stroll. I turned to him, my heart hammering against my ribs. He adjusted his jacket lapels, placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, and whispered a sentence I will remember for the rest of my life. Time for the real show. Before I could react, Dad stepped out into the center aisle. People at the adjacent tables murmured in confusion. On stage, the MC faltered, looking bewildered as an older gentleman calmly walked toward the front, his eyes radiating a bizarre, chilling serenity. Dad raised his hand, signaling for a microphone. The entire ballroom went dead silent. It was a thick, compressed silence, like the heavy drop in barometric pressure right before a massive thunderstorm. Richard stood at the podium, his practiced smile suddenly freezing in place. The MC hesitated for a few seconds, before tentatively handing a wireless mic to my dad. Dad took it, swept his gaze across the room past the curious, baffled faces, and locked eyes with Richard. When he spoke, his voice was deep, resonant, and didn't require him to shout. Excuse me, everyone. I just have one very brief question. The room held its breath. In that inspiring startup story we just heard, Dad continued, who was the person who actually put up the initial capital? 1 second, 2 seconds. Nobody clapped. Nobody laughed. Richard opened his mouth, but before he could formulate a syllable, my dad smiled that same cold smirk and laid down his words like a royal flush on a poker table. Ah! If Richard can't seem to recall, allow me to remind him, because that person is sitting right here. Dad turned and pointed directly at me. And for the first time that evening, I felt the entire room physically tilt. The ballroom plunged into a bizarre void. It wasn't the polite silence following a tough Q&A question. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, as if someone had pulled the plug on the room's oxygen. The clinking of silverware vanished. The hum of the HVAC system suddenly sounded deafening, Hundreds of eyes pivoted from the stage where Richard stood to my dad, the man who had casually dropped an unscripted bomb into the gala. Richard gripped the edges of the podium. I saw it clearly. His knuckles turned bone white, and his hands trembled. It was a micro-expression, over in a flash, but to a woman who had spent a decade by his side, it was glaring. It was the visceral reflex of a man entirely caught off guard, scrambling for balance as the earth cracked open beneath his feet. Richard forced a chuckle, but the corners of his mouth were rigid. "Arthur, I'm sorry, what are you getting at?" He tried desperately to keep his tone even and respectful. My dad didn't answer him immediately. He stood tall in the aisle, microphone in hand, his gaze slowly sweeping over the VIP tables, the veteran board members, the institutional investors, the venture capitalists who were now narrowing their eyes. Only then did he turn back to Richard. His voice cut through the air, low and crystal clear. "What I'm getting at is remarkably simple. Who was the person who wired the real cash to fund this company when it didn't even have a name, a logo, or a single dime of revenue?" Someone near the stage coughed, shattering the suffocating tension. At another table, a few heads leaned together, whispering frantically. I saw Eleanor, my ex-mother-in-law, shifting aggressively in her front row seat. She gripped her Birkin bag so tightly her veins popped, as if the leather tote could somehow shield her from what was happening. Richard cleared his throat. "Arthur, that is an internal corporate matter. Tonight is a celebration." "If it's a celebration of the company's history," my dad interrupted smoothly, his composure unshaken, "then it's the perfect time to clarify it. Because the history of this enterprise is what people will be trading on long after tonight." The atmosphere turned to ice. The MC stood paralyzed, the smile plastered on his face looking grotesque, unsure whether to call security or back away. Event coordinators by the stage exchanged panicked looks, but it was too late. When a question like that is aired in front of 500 high-net-worth individuals, no one has the luxury of pretending they didn't hear it. Richard looked toward the board of directors, silently begging for an intervention. But the silver-haired men who had been nodding in approval just minutes ago were now dead silent. They averted their eyes, staring at their phones or their empty plates, mentally calculating the legal implications of what was being alleged. Dad kept going, not rushing, not dragging. On the day of incorporation, a wire transfer hit the Vanguard Tech operating account. It wasn't venture capital. It was life savings. Whose name was on that wire? This time, I heard Richard audibly swallow through the sound system. He opened his mouth, then shut it. 1 second, 2 seconds. Every passing moment stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. I felt my heart pounding, but not out of fear. It was the adrenaline of watching the truth finally claw its way out of the dark. In the back rows, whispers erupted into audible chatter. Is that his ex-wife? I thought she was the one who wrote the original pitch deck. Wait, wasn't she forced out last month? The puzzle pieces were clicking together in real time. Richard took a deep breath, trying to summon his executive voice. "Arthur, you are creating a massive misunderstanding here. This company is my life's work. My blood and sweat." "Your blood and sweat," Dad repeated, his lip curling slightly. "But someone else's equity." A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the room. Richard's face drained of color, pale despite the warm stage lighting. I looked at the man who had once stayed up with me until 3 a.m., analyzing burn rates and cash flow. Right now, he looked utterly stranded on his own stage. Dad turned back to me. Just one look, but it made my chest tighten. In his eyes, there was no fury, no malice, no gloating. Just one simple, unwavering question. "Are you ready?" I stood up. My chair scraped against the carpet, a soft sound, but amplified in the quiet room. Heads whipped in my direction. I stepped out from behind the table, feeling the plush red carpet beneath my heels. I didn't flinch. I projected my voice. I didn't scream, but I made sure every person at the VIP tables heard me. That initial capital was mine. The room erupted. Richard whipped his head toward me. For the first time, his eyes weren't filled with arrogant confidence or dismissive pity. They were filled with the raw, unfiltered panic of a cornered animal. I stared right back at him, so calm that I even surprised myself. "And if you'd like," I added, "I can tell everyone the exact date, the routing number, and the minute the wire cleared." In that second, I knew this was no longer a domestic dispute between Sarah and Richard. This was a buried corporate crime being exhumed in front of Wall Street. The chessboard hadn't just flipped, it was my turn to play. The moment those words left my mouth, the decorum in the ballroom shattered. Whispers escalated into a low roar, bouncing from table to table, row to row. The polite, high society facade disintegrated. The gazes that had previously offered me apathy, curiosity, or pity were now locked onto me, razor sharp and unblinking. On stage, Richard looked like he had been turned to stone. The microphone in his hand drifted lower, revealing a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He couldn't look at me. He stared at the floor, as if desperately searching the hardwood for a legally safe response. Then, Eleanor, my ex-mother-in-law, shot out of her front row seat. "What is this garbage?" she shrieked. Her shrill voice sliced through the murmuring crowd. "You are divorced. What right do you have to stand here and make up these lies?" She lunged forward half a step, but an event coordinator quickly and gently blocked her path. I looked at her, and my heart suddenly felt entirely hollow. For 10 years, I had bent over backwards hoping she would look at me as a daughter. Now, I felt nothing but pity for a woman terrified of losing a status she hadn't earned. "I'm not making up anything, Eleanor," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I am stating a fact." At the VIP table, the board chairman, the silver-haired man, set his wine glass down. The crystal clinked sharply against the table. He stood up, smoothing his jacket, his expression grave. He looked up at Richard. "Richard, I think this requires immediate clarification." Richard's head snapped up. Sweat was now visible at his temples. "Sir, please, this is a messy domestic issue. We shouldn't let, when it involves the foundational capitalization of this company." The chairman cut him off with a voice like a steel blade. "It is a board issue." Several other board members nodded grimly. Men in custom suits pulled out their phones, others opened their leather portfolios. Nobody was smiling. Nobody was drinking champagne. The celebratory atmosphere had completely morphed into a collective, forensic suspicion. My dad took another step forward, standing right beside me. He didn't ask for the microphone back. He spoke directly to the front row. "We did not come here to cause a scene. We came to ensure that the actual equity of this company bears the correct names." He looked directly at the company's chief legal officer, who was sitting rigidly in his chair. "If the board requires it, we are fully prepared to submit the original wire transfer receipts, the founding operating agreements, and the minutes from the seed round meetings." "Isn't that right, Sarah?" I nodded. Yes. Panic finally overrode Richard's programming. He stepped forward to the edge of the stage, his voice rushed. "Sarah, we can talk about this in private. You don't need to make a spectacle out of this." I looked up at him. Suddenly, I felt sorry for him. I articulated every word with absolute clarity. "I stayed quiet for a very long time, Richard. The spectacle isn't my doing. It's the consequence of yours." The room went dead silent again. A woman at the adjacent table leaned over to her colleague and whispered loudly, "So, that's what happened. No wonder she just vanished from the executive team last month." Towards the back, several early-stage employees, people I had managed, exchanged wide-eyed looks. The realization dawning on them as a long-suspected truth was finally confirmed. Richard turned to the MC and hissed something. The MC looked helplessly at the event planners, but this had spiraled far beyond the run of show. When a multi-million-dollar fraud is alleged in public, no one has the authority to cut the mic. The chairman stood up to his full height and spoke with absolute finality. "I am calling for an immediate suspension of the inauguration proceedings. The board requires an emergency session." That sentence dropped over the room like an anvil. Eleanor's face drained of color. She muttered something incoherent, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her phone. Richard took a half step back. It was a tiny physical movement, but I saw it for what it was, his very first retreat of the night. I took a deep breath. My chest rose and fell, but the trembling was completely gone. I realized I was standing taller than I had in years. Dad leaned in and murmured, just for me to hear. See? When you turn on the lights, the cockroaches have nowhere to hide. I looked around the ballroom. The eyes fixed on me no longer saw a defeated ex-wife. They saw curiosity, shock, and a creeping sense of respect. In that split second, the ultimate truth crystallized in my mind. You don't need to scream the truth. You just need to introduce it at the exact right time. The gala was no longer a gala. It was the opening deposition in the dismantling of Richard's empire. And I, the woman they tried to erase, was standing dead center in the room. Before the crowd could fully process the chairman's decree, the strobe lights at the back of the hall suddenly flashed. I realized instantly what it was: the business press. They hadn't been invited to investigate, but to document a coronation. Now, however, the camera lenses were pivoting wildly between the stage and where I stood. Richard saw it too. He took a sharp breath, violently adjusted his tie, and within a fraction of a second, strapped a brand new mask onto his face. The mask of the magnanimous, controlled, rational CEO. He walked down the stage stairs. He didn't run. He didn't stumble. His steps were measured and deliberate, as if this PR disaster was just another pivot in his master plan. He stopped right in front of me and extended his hand. It was a picture-perfect gesture. The cameras instantly fired off rapid bursts. Click, click, click. He spoke loudly enough for the microphones to catch, injecting a tone of wounded benevolence into his voice. Sarah, despite our divorce, you were my partner in the early days. If there's been a misunderstanding regarding your exit package, I believe we should handle this like civilized adults. Civilized. There was that word again. His hand hung suspended in the air. It was a masterfully laid trap for the media. If I shook his hand, the headline would read that I had been pacified. If I refused, I would be painted as the bitter, hysterical ex-wife ruining a corporate milestone. The ballroom held its collective breath. My dad didn't intervene. He stood back, watching like a grandmaster analyzing a predictable chess move. I stared at Richard's hand. I remembered that exact hand-forging signatures I was never allowed to see. That hand resting on my shoulder as he said, "Take a break. Let me handle the lawyers." That hand quietly stripping me of my life's work before waving goodbye. I didn't take it immediately. I looked up, locking eyes with him long enough for the telephoto lenses to capture the sheer coldness in my expression. Then, I reached out. Our hands touched, but I didn't squeeze. I held it limp, maintaining a freezing, clinical distance. I completely agree to handling this in a civilized manner, Richard, I said, my voice eerily calm. But civilization requires the truth. Richard's PR smile glitched for half a second. It was fast, but I saw it, and my dad saw it. A reporter from a tech journal stepped forward, shouting over the murmurs. "Ma'am, can you confirm on the record that you were the primary seed investor for Vanguard Tech?" The room went dead quiet. Richard opened his mouth to spin it, but I beat him to the punch. I confirm it, and I am fully prepared to cooperate with the board of directors, independent auditors, and the SEC to clarify the paper trail. No insults, no hysteria, just absolute, terrifying compliance. There is nothing more dangerous to a liar than a victim demanding an audit. Richard yanked his hand back. He offered a strained, tight-lipped smile to the press pool. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. This is a private legal matter currently under review. Tonight is meant to be a celebration. The celebration," my dad's voice boomed, cutting through the PR spin, "has been suspended." Dad stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Richard. Two men facing off, one desperately clinging to his optics, the other completely indifferent to them. "You just shook my daughter's hand for the cameras," Dad said. "Excellent. So, for the cameras, let me ask you one more thing." Richard's eyes darted, flashing pure panic. "Those cap table amendments filed last month," Dad asked. "When exactly did you sign them?" Another collective gasp echoed through the room. A direct, lethal strike to the jugular. Richard took a half step back. He forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow and thin. "I signed them pursuant to a board resolution." "Which resolution?" Dad fired back instantly. "From which meeting? Where are the minutes?" Richard froze. He didn't answer. Not because he couldn't invent a lie, but because he knew that any lie spoken on camera right now would become Exhibit A in federal court. The cameras pushed in closer. Standing beside them, I realized Richard's desperate handshake hadn't saved him. It had only pulled him deeper into the spotlight, exposing his fraud to the public. In that moment, I understood. When a predator suddenly plays the victim, it means they have completely lost control. This gala was no longer about raising a glass. It was an interrogation. And I knew the final nail in the coffin wasn't going to come from me. Following the handshake for the cameras, the explosive tension in the room morphed into something far more dangerous. A suffocating, clinical silence. It felt like walking into an airtight vault that had just been unsealed. No one knew whether to speak or hold their breath. Richard turned back toward the stage, desperately trying to regain the high ground. The MC hovered nearby, holding his run-of-show clipboard like a shield, completely lost. The event organizers were practically melting into the shadows. The lively chatter from the tables had dissolved into relentless, rhythmic whispering like waves eroding a cliffside. I was just about to step back to my table when the sensation of being watched made me pause. It wasn't the aggressive stare of a reporter or the judgmental glare of a peer. It was a look of profound, knowing recognition. I turned to my left. At a table near the perimeter, an older gentleman was sitting rigidly upright. He wore a dark, classic cut suit. His hair was silver at the temples, his face angular, and his eyes possessed the piercing, analytical depth of a man who spent his life dissecting financial ledgers rather than flattering egos. When I caught his eye, he didn't look away. Instead, he gave me a subtle, deliberate nod, an acknowledgement. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know him. I was almost certain of it, but his demeanor suggested he knew exactly who I was. My dad noticed him too. He paused, his gaze locking onto the man a second longer than normal. A flash of cautious recognition crossed my dad's face, quickly settling into quiet composure. The two men exchanged a silent, wordless communication across the room. It was brief, but it spoke volumes. They were not strangers. Richard, meanwhile, had his back to the crowd, furiously whispering to his VP of operations. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin white line, clutching her phone as if waiting for a miracle dial. The older gentleman stood up. He didn't march straight toward the stage. He took the side aisle, walking with a slow, heavy, and undeniably authoritative cadence. He wasn't rushing. He didn't need to demand attention. His presence commanded it. As he walked, the whispers died down, and heads turned to follow him. He stopped a few feet away from me. "You're the one who just brought up the initial seed capital. Is that correct?" he asked. His voice was a rich baritone, stripped of any theatrical emotion. I nodded. Yes. He studied me for another second, then offered a microscopic smile, barely a twitch of the lips. I thought so. Before I could ask who he was, he turned to my dad. "Arthur. Still the same." "I see," he said, speaking like an old war buddy. "You sit back when you can afford to, but when you strike, you don't miss by an inch." My dad let out a slow exhale. "Robert. I just don't take kindly to people making a fool out of my daughter." They spoke briefly, but it felt like a massive curtain had just been ripped away from a hidden window. I looked at my dad, my eyes demanding an explanation. Dad leaned in and spoke clearly, making sure I heard every syllable. "Sarah, do you remember Robert Sterling? The venture capitalist who approved Vanguard's very first bridge loan?" I froze. A tidal wave of memories crashed over me. A rainy afternoon in Chicago, a cramped conference room, a stoic man who asked exactly 3 brutal questions about our burn rate, cash flow, and runway. I had been the one presenting the pitch deck. Richard had just sat next to me, sweating. "Mr. Sterling?" I asked, unable to mask my shock. He nodded. "It's been a long time, Sarah. I came tonight out of sheer corporate obligation. I planned to have a drink and leave. But after hearing what just went down, I figured I needed to stand up." My stomach dropped. "Why?" He looked past me, fixing his gaze on Richard, who was currently attempting to project an aura of unbothered control on the stage. "Because," Mr. Sterling said slowly, "I realized I was listening to a man narrate a history book while actively erasing its primary author. Across the room, Richard finally noticed the gathering. He stepped down, flashing a rapid-fire, desperate smile. "Robert, I didn't realize you were in the crowd tonight." His voice was pitched half an octave too high. Mr. Sterling looked at Richard with eyes like crushed ice. "I am. And I was just listening to you talk about laying the foundation." The air pressure in the room plummeted. Richard forced a chuckle. "Ancient history, Robert. We all chipped in." "Chipped in, Mr." Sterling repeated flatly. He turned to look at me. "But only one person chipped in the cash, the operational blueprints, and put their personal credit on the line to secure that first loan." He turned back to Richard. "All you contributed was a signature." Someone nearby gasped. Richard's face went ashen. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but Mr. Sterling held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "I don't take sides in divorces, Richard," Mr. Sterling said. "I take the side of the ledger. And the ledger doesn't lie." He turned back to me, his voice dropping to a softer register. "Sarah, do you still have the wire transfer receipts from that day?" I nodded firmly. "I do." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Good. Then tonight's agenda is far from over." A shiver ran down my spine. Not from fear, but from a profound realization. This billionaire investor didn't stand up to give a speech. He stood up to drag the receipts into the daylight. I looked at Richard. For the first time all night, he couldn't meet my eyes. The play he thought he was directing had just been hijacked by the executive producer. The MC, desperate to regain control of the room, tapped the mic. He plastered on a terrified smile and spoke loudly, trying to drown out the murmurs. "Thank you all for your passionate remarks. We will now continue the evening with a presentation of Vanguard Tech's strategic roadmap by the executive team." The chandeliers dimmed. All eyes reluctantly turned back to the stage. Richard stood tall, took a deep breath, and gripped the podium. I could see how desperately he needed this transition. He needed to bury the capital questions under a mountain of corporate jargon and pie charts. The massive LED screen flared to life behind him. Standard corporate slides appeared. Revenue projections, market expansion maps, Q3 growth metrics, highlighted in optimistic neon green. Richard's voice returned, steadier now, as if he had found his footing. Moving into the next fiscal year, Vanguard Tech will pivot on 3 core pillars. He spoke fluidly. The crowd settled down, though the energy remained deeply cynical. I knew what he was doing, sprinting through the minefield, hoping that if he talked fast enough, people would forget the bombs. Then, the screen glitched. It was a minor flicker, but anyone near the front row caught it. Richard paused for a fraction of a second, glaring at the AV booth in the back. A tech guy gave him a frantic thumbs up. Richard resumed speaking. 10 seconds later, the screen went completely black. The ballroom erupted in confused chatter. Richard spun around, losing his temper. "What's going on back there?" He snapped into the mic. Before anyone could answer, the screen flared back to life, but it wasn't a pie chart. It was a high-resolution scan of a bank wire transfer, magnified so massively that even the back row could read it. The sender's name was circled in thick red ink. The date, the routing number, and the memo line were crystal clear. Initial seed capital, Vanguard Tech LLC. The crowd let out a collective, stunned gasp. Richard stood frozen, staring at the screen. "Wait, what is that? Why are they projecting this? Hold on. Look at the sender's name." My name was plastered across 20 feet of LED paneling. Indisputable. Irrefutable. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I didn't panic. The moment I had seen Mr. Sterling look at my dad, I had an inkling of what was coming. Richard spun toward the AV booth, his voice cracking into a yell. "Who authorized this?" Mr. Sterling stepped forward. He didn't have a microphone, but his baritone voice projected perfectly across the silenced room. "That document, Mr. Sterling declared, was submitted to my firm as part of the due diligence packet for your first bridge loan. I simply requested the AV team to display the historical data accurately." Richard looked like he was going to vomit. Sweat beaded on his forehead, glistening under the stage lights. Dad stood beside me, his voice low and steady. See, Sarah? The truth doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be plugged in. The screen clicked to the next slide. An email chain appeared. It was an exchange between me and Mr. Sterling, detailing the cash burn rate, the debt repayment schedule, and the operational strategy. Sitting quietly in the CC line at the top corner was Richard's email address, absolute proof that he had known about my capital injection from day one. The murmurs swelled into aggressive, open debates. A major institutional shareholder stood up, his face red with anger. "Richard, care to explain this?" Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The microphone was live, but his voice was trapped in his throat. The MC fumbled, reaching out as if to physically turn off the screen, but Mr. Sterling raised a hand. "Allow me to finish," Mr. Sterling commanded. He turned to face the board of directors. "When I reviewed the proxy materials for tonight's CEO confirmation last week, her name," he pointed directly at me, "was entirely absent from the cap table. That is a material omission of fact. A fatal one." Richard lowered his head. He didn't do it out of humility. He did it because he literally had nowhere else to look. Standing there, bathed in the glow of my own bank statement, I felt a profound sense of vindication. The gala had completely slipped from Richard's grasp. Everything he had secretly deleted from the corporate servers was now being broadcast to the very people he needed to impress. The screen clicked to one final slide. White background, bold black text. "Foundational cap table requires immediate, independent audit." The room plunged into a new kind of silence. Heavier, darker. This was no longer suspicion. This was documentary evidence of corporate fraud. The inauguration had transformed into a public tribunal. After that final slide flashed on the screen, no one spoke for several agonizing seconds. It was the kind of silence where you could hear the blood rushing in your own ears. Silk-covered chairs stopped shifting. Nobody dared to lift a champagne flute. Everyone was waiting, but nobody knew what exactly was about to happen. Richard remained on stage. His posture was still upright, but his shoulders slumped. The microphone dangled uselessly by his side. He no longer looked like a visionary CEO. He looked like a man who had just been stripped naked in the middle of Times Square, his arrogance replaced by pure, exhausted panic. "All right," my dad said, breaking the quiet. He didn't yell. He didn't rush. He simply stood up from his chair. The motion was mundane, yet every eye in the room snapped to him. True power doesn't require a podium. It's in how a man holds himself in a room full of chaos. Dad straightened his tie, stepped into the aisle, and faced the stage. "Excuse me," Dad said, his voice deep and echoing. "I have one final question." No one interrupted him. No one dared. He didn't look at Richard. He looked directly at the board of directors, sitting rigidly in the front row. In the executive dossier distributed for tonight's confirmation, there is a verified list of founding shareholders. Is that correct? A board member cleared his throat. "Yes, that's correct." "Then I must ask," Dad continued, "upon what legal documentation did the board rely to certify that list as accurate?" The question dropped like an anvil. Richard snapped his head toward the chief legal officer, silently begging for a lifeline. But the CLO refused to meet his gaze, nervously flipping through a leather binder, his hands trembling. Dad didn't wait for an answer. Because based on the empirical evidence currently illuminating this room, he pointed at the LED screen. At least one primary equity holder was purged from that list. He turned to me, his voice softening slightly, but still carrying across the hall. "And that person is my daughter." A shock wave of whispers erupted. I saw board members exchanging frantic, terrified looks. Institutional investors whipped out their phones, firing off emails to their legal teams. Richard lunged forward, his voice cracking. "Arthur, please, can we handle this in the boardroom tomorrow?" "Tomorrow?" Dad interrupted, his voice cracking like a whip. "When is tomorrow?" "After everyone has signed the ratifications, popped the champagne, and pretended none of this happened." Richard froze. Dad stared right through him. "I have no objection to you being the CEO, Richard. I object to you being crowned CEO based on a fabricated history." A few murmurs of "he's right" rippled from the back rows. Dad pivoted back to the board. "If tonight is truly about transparency, then the shareholders deserve to know. Who drafted the amended cap table? Who signed the transfer authorizations? And who carries the fiduciary liability if those documents are fraudulent? The air in the room turned to liquid nitrogen. The MC looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Event staff were furiously texting in the corners. Eleanor had sunk so low in her chair, she was practically under the table, gripping her Birkin as if the SEC was about to confiscate it. Finally, the chairman of the board stood up. He looked sick. We must temporarily adjourn these proceedings to conduct a legal review of the filings. Dad nodded slowly. That sounds like a prudent fiduciary decision. He turned to me and placed a hand on my shoulder, a brief, grounding touch that fortified me more than 1,000 words of encouragement. Richard stood alone on the brightly lit stage, completely engulfed in metaphorical darkness. I looked at him. I felt no rage, no heartbreak, just a cold, undeniable clarity. When you build your empire on forged paper, you shouldn't be surprised when a single match burns it to the ground. The CEO gala had suffered a catastrophic abort, and I knew that from the moment my dad stood up and said, "I have a question," we had crossed the Rubicon. There was no going back. The gala was officially suspended, but nobody moved toward the exits. Not out of politeness, but because nobody wanted to miss the fallout. The atmosphere was no longer tense. It was radioactive. The board of directors huddled in the corner, furiously whispering to outside counsel on their cell phones. Richard stepped off the stage. He no longer commanded the center of the room. He walked over to the board's table, his back to the crowd. I could see the physical toll the last 30 minutes had taken on him. His shoulders slouched so heavily he looked like he had aged 5 years. One of the board members, a senior partner at a private equity firm, turned to my dad, his voice tight. "You claim you have the original documentation to substantiate this?" "I do," Dad replied evenly. "And unlike the filings in your binder, mine are authenticated." He looked at me. I knew exactly what to do. I unlatched my handbag and pulled out a slim manila folder. It wasn't thick, it wasn't dramatic, but every single page inside was a document they had tried to wipe from existence. I walked over and placed the folder on the mahogany table. The soft thwack of the paper hitting the wood made Richard physically flinch. The PE partner put on his reading glasses and flipped open the folder. He scanned the first page, his brow furrowing deeply. "These are the year 1 operational minutes, bearing your signature." He looked up at me. "Yes," I said. "And his." I glanced at Richard. He didn't deny it. He just stared at the floor. The board member flipped the page. "The Series A equity agreement. You are listed as holding 40% of the voting shares." "Yes." "Then how?" the man asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Did your name disappear from the SEC filings submitted prior to this buyout?" The question echoed like a gunshot. Richard scrambled, his voice raspy and desperate. That was part of our post-divorce settlement." I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a hunter watching the prey step directly into the snare. "You're absolutely right, Richard," I said smoothly. "We did have a settlement, but that settlement contained 0 provisions regarding the transfer of corporate equity." I pulled a stapled document from the back of the folder. "Here is the finalized divorce decree, stamped by the Cook County Court. Feel free to review it." The room was dead silent. Another board member snatched the decree, his eyes darting across the legalese. He looked up, his face grim. "There is no equity forfeiture clause here. No stock transfer agreement." He turned his glaring eyes to Richard. "Care to explain?" Richard gripped the edge of the table. She gave verbal consent." A collective scoff erupted from the surrounding investors. My dad let out a dry, mocking laugh. "Verbal consent?" he repeated. "Fascinating. Then perhaps you can explain whose signature is on the stock transfer certificates filed with the state?" The PE partner slid the corporate binder toward Richard, tapping a page with his pen. Richard stared at it. I could see his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. "I signed the executive authorization," Richard muttered. "And the authorizing signature of the relinquishing shareholder?" The board member pressed. Richard said nothing. The silence was the loudest confession I had ever heard. Under Delaware corporate law, my dad stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Transferring shares requires the verified, notarized signature of the holding party. If my daughter didn't sign it, what exactly are we looking at here? Gentlemen, a lawyer sitting near the board whispered loudly, that constitutes felony wire fraud and forgery. Richard's head snapped up. I didn't forge anything. We haven't concluded. We will conclude it when the forensic handwriting experts review it tomorrow morning, the chairman interrupted, his voice laced with venom. I looked at Richard. For the first time since the divorce, his mask of arrogant invincibility had completely shattered. The terror in his eyes was raw and real. My dad leaned in and whispered to me, "You see? When men build their castles on fraudulent paper, the paper is always the first thing to cut their throats." I nodded. The final puzzle piece had clicked into place. They thought they could steal a multi-million-dollar company by burying me in paperwork. They forgot one fundamental rule. Paperwork has no loyalty. It only holds the truth or the crime. And when the crime is laid bare in front of Wall Street, the fake smiles melt away instantly. The game wasn't about verbal arguments anymore. It was about signatures. And the man who signed the fake documents was about to lose everything. Before the phrase handwriting experts could fully settle over the terrified crowd, a shrill, hysterical voice ripped through the heavy silence. Enough! Eleanor shoved her chair back so violently, it screeched against the floorboards. She marched forward, her face flushed crimson. Her eyes were wild with the panic of a woman watching her country club membership evaporate. But she pitched her voice loud and sharp, the desperate tactic of someone trying to bully a crowd into submission. I will not sit here and listen to this little gold digger spew any more lies. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. She is divorced. She took the payout, and now she's slithering back to steal half the company. It's nothing but pure, unadulterated greed. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. I saw a few faces waver. Some people didn't understand the corporate law at play. They only heard the emotionally charged buzzwords: divorced, payout, greed. That was exactly her goal. Richard looked at his mother, a flash of horror crossing his face. Not because she was lying, but because she was talking way too much. But Eleanor was fully derailed. From day one, my son built this empire, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the chandeliers. He handled the lawyers. He schmoozed the investors. He took all the risk. And her? She sneered at me. She sat at a desk and signed a few meaningless papers, and now she wants the lion's share. A few people in the back nodded, not because they believed her, but because they hadn't pieced together the legal reality yet. Dad started to step forward, but I put a hand on his arm. "Let me," I said. The entire ballroom turned to look at me. I stared directly at Eleanor. For the first time, I didn't address her as Mom. That word had died a long time ago. I kept my voice dead level, not screaming, not trembling. "You call me greedy, Eleanor. Let me ask you a question." She faltered for a half-second, then jutted her chin out. "Go ahead. Was I greedy when I emptied my personal 401k to fund the seed capital?" I asked, taking a step toward her. "Was I greedy when I stayed up for 3 days straight, writing the prospectus that secured our first venture loan? Was I greedy when I put my personal credit on the line as collateral so Vanguard Tech could make payroll?" I took another step. The room was deathly silent. Or was I greedy when I signed a divorce decree walking away with 0 alimony and 0 marital assets because I actually trusted my family wouldn't commit corporate fraud? A soft gasp echoed from the back tables. Eleanor's face flushed purple. She floundered, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. You didn't take it because you knew you didn't deserve it. And now you're back for a handout." I smiled, a sad, tired smile. "I didn't come back to demand a handout, Eleanor. I came back because someone stole $40 million that legally belongs to me." A female board member stood up. Her voice was icy and precise. "Ma'am, you claim she took a payout. What payout? Do you have the financial schedules?" Eleanor swallowed hard. The divorce settlement. "We need to see the schedules," the female board member demanded. No emotion, no drama, just a cold demand for proof. Eleanor whipped her head toward Richard. Richard stood frozen, looking like a ghost. My dad spoke up, his voice booming like a gavel striking wood. Spousal support and marital asset division fall under family law. Corporate equity and shareholder rights fall under the jurisdiction of the SEC and Delaware Corporate Code. You cannot legally commingle the two to erase a founder's shares. Several investors nodded vigorously. The tide had officially turned. The room was no longer swayed by reality TV drama. It was operating on cold, hard corporate reality. "Where is the stock purchase agreement?" someone shouted from the back. "Where is the notarized forfeiture?" Every question was a knife in the balloon of Richard's lies. Eleanor began hyperventilating. She finally realized she had dragged the argument out of the realm of family gossip and into federal jurisdiction, a place where her tears and screaming meant absolutely nothing. She looked at me, her voice dropping into a pathetic, trembling whisper. "Sarah, how could you? Don't you care about the family's reputation?" I looked at her for a long time. Then, I spoke, slow and clear. "I spent 10 years protecting this family's reputation. Tonight, I am protecting my own." The room plunged back into silence. Not tense, just final. I realized that when the truth is backed by ironclad proof, personal attacks only expose the sheer terror of the attacker. Eleanor collapsed back into her chair, utterly defeated. And for the first time that night, I stood perfectly straight, without needing to silently pep-talk myself. Because the moment she called me a greedy ex-wife, her emotional manipulation failed. From this second on, the only thing that mattered was the evidence. After Eleanor slumped into her chair, no one in the room uttered another emotionally charged word. The audience's eyes locked onto the board of directors. They were no longer picking sides based on sympathy or gossip. They were siding with the irrefutable paper trail sitting on the mahogany table. The chairman of the board, the silver-haired man, stood up. He didn't use a microphone. His deep, gravelly voice carried the weight of a man about to execute a billion-dollar decision. Effective immediately, the chairman announced, the board of directors is suspending the confirmation of Richard as chief executive officer. This suspension will remain in place pending a full forensic audit of the cap table, the founding documents, and the signatures in question. The words struck the room like a guillotine blade. Richard stood completely paralyzed. The spotlights were still shining, but there was no applause, no champagne toasts, no coronation. He was just a man in an expensive tuxedo, standing totally isolated at what was supposed to be the pinnacle of his life. The chairman turned his gaze to me. "Miss Sarah, will you agree to coordinate with our independent auditors and the SEC investigators this coming week to provide the original documents?" I nodded firmly. "Absolutely. My legal team will be in touch tomorrow morning." He nodded back. For the first time, his look wasn't skeptical. It was a look of professional respect. Richard finally moved. He took a few steps toward me, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper. "Sarah, did you really have to push it this far?" I looked at him. I didn't see the husband I once loved. I didn't see the man I had sacrificed my youth to build a life with. I just saw a fraudster who got caught. "I didn't push it anywhere, Richard," I replied quietly. "I just stopped covering for you." He dropped his gaze. For the first time, I saw a man who realized he had absolutely nothing left to lean on. Eleanor refused to look at me. Her lips trembled, but she didn't utter a word. In her eyes, I saw the agonizing realization of someone who had gambled her entire high society existence and lost. But none of that mattered to me anymore. The gala dissolved into chaotic murmurs. There was no formal dismissal. People just began quietly gathering their coats and leaving, taking with them a brutal corporate lesson that was never listed on the invitation. I walked out of the ballroom, side by side with my dad. Stepping out through the revolving glass doors, the crisp Chicago night air hit my face. The streetlights glowed yellow against the pavement. Cabs honked. People laughed on the sidewalks. The city was moving forward, entirely indifferent to the empire that had just collapsed behind those hotel doors. I took a massive, deep breath. For the first time in years, my chest didn't feel like it was wrapped in iron bands. Dad stopped on the sidewalk and looked at me, a warm, proud smile touching the corners of his eyes. "You did good tonight, kid." I shook my head, offering a soft smile in return. "I didn't do anything extraordinary, Dad. I just finally stopped running away." He patted my shoulder. "That's all it takes." Months later, The forensic audit results were made public. The stock transfer signatures were definitively proven to be forged. The amended SEC filings were voided. Richard was permanently ousted by the board, stripped of all executive authority, and faced federal indictments. The company was legally restructured to reflect the original operating agreement. I didn't return to take the CEO spot. Instead, I executed a legal buyout, cashed out my rightful $40 million in equity, and walked away quietly. No gloating, no revenge tours. Some of my old colleagues asked me, "Why didn't you stay? Vanguard Tech was your baby." I just smiled, because I had learned that some places, no matter how much you once dreamed of them, are just beds you shouldn't go back to sleep in once you've finally woken up. I started a new life. No drama, no spotlights, just peace. And I walked away with a profound realization, one I might never have learned if I hadn't been forced to walk through the fire. Thieves can steal your money, and they can steal your titles, but they can never steal your core value as a human being. To many, that gala was the scandal of the decade. To me, it was the night I finally won myself back. The lesson: there are times in life when we must stay quiet to preserve our peace. But there are also moments when staying quiet means losing your soul. This story isn't about petty revenge or proving who is smarter. It is about the absolute value of the truth and human dignity. When you do the right thing, do not fear the smear campaigns. When everything is taken from you, do not surrender to despair. And when you have the evidence and the courage, stand up straight and speak the truth. Marriages may shatter, fortunes may be stolen, but if you retain your character, your intellect, and your bravery, no one can ever steal your future. Scars will always hurt, but they are exactly what teach us to be sharper, stronger, and more awake in this world. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story resonated with you, or if it reflected a chapter of your own life, please leave a like to support the channel. Drop a comment to share your thoughts or your own experiences. And don't forget to subscribe too, so we can continue to reflect, heal, and grow through these raw, deeply human tales. Every subscription gives us the motivation to bring you more meaningful content. Thank you, and may you always find peace.